I am so happy to be here. Thank you so much to the organizers for the invitation and all of you attending. It is really amazing to be able to participate. I am especially grateful that I could do this remotely, as there was still a lot of uncertainty around traveling with the pandemic when I accepted the invitation. This talk is a collection of thoughts and conversations that I've had over the past few years, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what other people have to say as well. It's possible that many of the things I'll mention here are obvious to you, and it is also possible that this is the first time you're thinking about it. Either way, I'd love to hear from you and get this conversation going. A lot of the things that I'll say come from my experience in open source projects, but that doesn't mean that it can't also be applied in other contexts. So I am especially curious to hear your thoughts on applying the same ideas to other kinds of projects. So my name is Melissa. I am based in Brazil, where I'm originally from, and I work as a software engineer at PyConDE. My work focuses on open source projects such as NumPy and SciPy. And although I don't like talking about myself too much, I'd like to give you some context as to how I got here. In 2019, I went to the SciPy conference in person in Austin, Texas. This is the picture that you're seeing right now. Although I had been around open source and Python for a while, mainly doing talks, outreach, education, and participating in meetups in Brazil, I was working as a professor of mathematics at the Federal University of Santa Catarina in the south of Brazil. My work focused on numerical optimization, and I had made the switch from MATLAB to Python a few years prior. And I wanted to get involved with the scientific Python community. I was unhappy at the university and the whole research thing. And I was looking for a career change. I got funding to go to SciPy in person and ended up joining the NumPy and SciPy Sprint and met Ralph Gummers, who is in the picture next to me, who at the time was recruiting for PyConDE. So the picture you see here is my first code contribution to open source. And 6 months later, I ended up joining PyConDE and leaving academia behind. So this is a reminder that although I do understand that it is extremely hard work and very complicated, I am eternally grateful that there are conferences still offering remote possibilities at this stage. It is very clear that in the last couple of years, a lot of people from the Global South have been able to participate and take part in conversations and in conferences and opportunities that they would not have otherwise, either because it's hard to travel because of funding or because of visa restrictions, or more recently because of vaccination passport restrictions. It is clear that participating in this kind of event opens up a lot of professional possibilities. So again, a reminder that if you can, and if there is a way, please continue offering remote possibilities for conferences. Now, why am I here today? Well, I'm sure you've seen, thought, or heard this before. There's a diversity problem in open source. What does this mean? It means that open source is largely white, from the global north, and male. A lot of people much more informed and experienced than me have tried to explain the reasons behind this, and I'm not sure I can contribute much to that conversation, except to say that there are more things involved than we as individuals or even as projects can control. Society, cultures, institutional racism, sexism, and xenophobia, the inequality of access to technologies, hardware, internet access, information, language barriers, the list goes on and on. Does this mean we should just give up? I don't think so. But we need to understand what we're talking about when we say there's a problem in open source. The Linux Foundation has elaborated a report on diversity, equity, and inclusion in open source in 2021. And in there, they defined diversity as follows. We define diversity within open source communities as a pluralism of any number of the following possibilities: gender identity and expression, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, social class, caste, language, physical and neurological ability and attributes, religious beliefs, value systems, national origin, and political affiliation. That's a mouthful. And even in this definition, we don't have a complete agreement. The definition changes, words change, the way we call things change. The first thing we need to understand is that diversity is and always will be a moving target. Again, this is not an excuse for not working on improving. Rather, this is an acknowledgement that this work is never done and that we should have a learning mindset, be prepared to listen, and change our minds frequently. Now, in this map, it doesn't actually represent the data, but it gives you an idea of the distribution of people working on open source, at least considering the Linux Foundation report from last year. North America and Europe accounted for 36% of survey respondents each. 15 of the respondents were from the Asia-Pacific region, 8% from Central and South America, and 5% from the Middle East and Africa. Open source is heavily skewed towards the global north. This is partially to be expected, as internet and technological infrastructure is also concentrated in these areas. But we must keep in mind whenever we talk about global open source projects that this is not actually true. Of course, there are also many other variables here. While 81% of people surveyed in this Linux Foundation survey can read and write English well, there are others for whom language presents a barrier to participation or belonging in open source communities. So, based on this data and this map, should we conclude that people in the global south are just not interested in open source? I don't think so. There are clearly explicit and implicit barriers that prevent people from the global south from joining open source projects. And this is also clearly true for other minoritized groups. Keep in mind that these may be invisible to you because of your position in the world. This is a complex problem, and I don't believe in a simple solution. However, even if we can't eliminate the factors that come from society or structures that we can't control, there is clearly room for improvement. I'm not an expert here. However, I don't believe only experts should be talking about this. We need to have these conversations more frequently and try things more often. I have learned to speak from my own experience and not that of others, so this is what I'll say. In my experience, I believe that there are at least 3 areas we can address right now that would actually improve the situation. First is the fact that we are relying at least partially on invisible labor, and I will explain that shortly. Second is that the way we organize our projects internally and how this can end up being an extension of the existing power structures around us can create problems. And third, the way we consciously or unconsciously fit people into stereotypes and end up limiting their possibilities. First, let's talk about who is working on open source. If we look at the Linux Foundation survey again, of the survey respondents, only 14% get paid for their open source contributions. And all of them mentioned that time is the number one determinant for participation in open source. Things like time zones, unpaid time, and onboarding time factor into when or how people can participate. It's no secret that open source relies on volunteer work, and this is not bad at all, and many other areas of our lives may depend on volunteer work. However, we must keep in mind that this does limit who gets to participate. We are relying on people spending their free time on this. Who has free time on their hands? Women, people of color, and other minoritized groups are disproportionately responsible for caring for children or relatives, doing housework, or being in a position to spend several hours commuting. For example, how can we expect this game to be fair if the number one determinant for participation can't be met? There is also a widespread belief in meritocracy, and that you only really learn things by doing them the hard way. I have suffered to learn this. You need to suffer as well. It's the read the manual attitude. When you pair this with the lack of free time, you have a recipe for exclusion. But there's yet another point to be made here. Not all contributions are visible on GitHub or any other issue tracker or website that you use to track work on open source projects. Answering questions on Slack or email, organizing surveys, meetings, social media, and all other kinds of glue work don't get you green squares on GitHub, and they end up being erased from project metrics. But at least once you join, everyone is the same, right? Well, many of our projects have internal hierarchies. For example, opposing code and non-code contributions, core developers being the highest point you can reach in a project over all kinds of contributions. Behind this all are welcome message, there's an unspoken expectation and rules, including cultural rules such as slang, acronyms, jargon, expected tone of interactions, and there's personal rules. For example, people from academia may have different expectations about working in collaboration with others than people in industry. Governance for projects is not always explicit and clear. How does one get to be a core developer? Do you have a process for someone to step down from your project? How long does someone need to contribute to be able to make decisions and be considered leadership for the project? There's an article that many people cite when talking about open source called The Tyranny of Structurelessness by Joe Freeman. This essay, that is inspired by her experiences in the 60s when she worked in a feminist group, talks about how an informal, unacknowledged, and unaccountable leadership arises when there's no defined hierarchy in a group. Freeman, in this essay, suggests formalizing the existing hierarchies in the group and subjecting them to democratic control to prevent that. I believe this can be, at least in part, applied to open source projects' organizational structures. Now, often, when you mention improving diversity in open source projects, you will hear things such as, yes, let's create more documentation issues, or no, this will lower the bar for a project. And this is something I've heard before. This shows how the power structures that I was mentioning before are translated into stereotypes, and people are immediately expected to conform to these positions. We could talk about gendered work just as an example. But there are many other aspects of this, including how people who are less proficient in English can be seen by native speakers as less experienced or less knowledgeable. All of this can severely limit the possibilities for contribution and growth inside a project. This can also mean that the weight of doing hard and unrecognized glue work that I mentioned earlier falls completely on the shoulders of people from underrepresented groups. When they join a project, they may be immediately sent to do work that will never give them enough credit to move over to leadership positions in the future. We need to be proactive about both things, not enforcing stereotypes and making sure that all contributions receive credit and recognition. Well, this is terrible, right? There are so many problems. How can we possibly improve this? This is not something we can solve overnight. We need strategy, we need more research, and we definitely need to talk about what's hard about this work. I do believe that a lot of progress has been made, which is why I named this talk Beyond the Basics. Many people in projects are, in fact, doing the basics. They have codes of conduct, they have contribution guidelines, they have good first issue labels on GitHub, and they have governance documentation. But we need to keep pushing forward. So, now that we know more or less how things are, what can we do? I want to propose this comparison of where we are now and where we want to be. What we have now is that many projects are using codes of conduct, they are improving and using inclusive language, they are trying to set up clear governance for their projects, but this is more of a passive stance in which you have your project, you kind of make things work inside of it, but you don't actively bring new people in. Where we want to be is actually push for a culture change. We want to question our assumptions about what's working in our own projects, and we want to investigate new and fair metrics. We want to be more active about how we improve the situation and what we can do inside our own projects. So, like I said, I am no expert, but I do have a few proposals of things that we can invest time and resources in. First, I am a big believer in mentorship. Mentorship is often very effective and can be powerful when it comes to changing culture. Through mentorship and creating this individual connection between a maintainer or an experienced contributor and a newcomer, you can really create pathways and encourage people and make them feel empowered to develop their own selves inside the project. Like I said before, setting clear expectations and developing trust in processes for governance ensures sustainability for the project. Mentorship is great, but we don't just want to have new contributors. We want to have new maintainers, and we want to have new leaders. This is what will help us get sustainability. Unless we can set up a pathway for new leaders, our projects are going to die. Now, we need to also encourage curiosity. We need to create a safe and welcoming environment for people of all backgrounds and experience levels to approach our project. That's the only way that we can cast a wide enough net to get people to contribute and create diverse cultures inside our projects. And for that, we also need to improve our contribution pathways. Providing a better distribution of work and celebrating different kinds of contributions is extremely important to diversify roles inside the project and the people who will approach the project in the first place. Now, how can we do this? We have been working for a while in the concept of contributor experience. Let's say that this is a dedicated effort to onboarding, retention, and a focus on diversifying contribution pathways. This particular work is being developed through a grant that we have received from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative to work on NumPy, SciPy, Matplotlib, and Pandas. So this is a cross-project grant. This is a 2-year project, and like I said before, this is not meant to be a simple solution to a complex problem, but rather an attempt to make progress, or find out that it doesn't work, but I hope not. This is especially about making volunteer contributor work easier. And it is also about cross-project analysis. There are many differences between projects, and we hope we can not only identify these differences, but understand the high-level wins that other projects downstream can also learn from. So, a little bit more about what is contributor experience. When we talk about attracting and onboarding first-time contributors, what do we want to do with those first-time contributors? If we look at the State of the Octoverse report from this year, the number of first-time contributors to open source projects is growing year over year. So there is no shortage of first-time contributors. What we want to do is work on retention, providing individual support such as mentoring, encouragement, empowerment, and making sure that they have a way into the project. Another way to improve that process is to create scaffolded contributions. What do we mean by that? If a task, a big project, takes a long time for a first-time contributor to understand what they even have to do there, or to finish that project, they may be less enthusiastic about starting to work in the first place. Creating smaller slices of tasks that people can pick up and work in smaller amounts of time may create more opportunities for contribution, for example. Another example is by having pair programming sessions along with their mentors or some other people, contributors in the community who can help. For this, we mentioned individual support, but we also want to create a network of collaboration for scale and sustainability. Again, we want new maintainers, not just new contributors. So we are working on creating newcomer spaces and not reliant on one single point of failure for each project or for each contribution that newcomers can make. We want to make sure that people have different paths to contribution, but also different means of communication. So in addition to GitHub, having meetings, forums, Slack, other points of communication that you can use or monitor can be helpful. This is hard work, so we need to be careful not to overdo it, but it does create a sense of connection and community and gives people the opportunity to not be constrained by conversation over text, which is notoriously difficult to get right. Now, how can we know that this is actually improving something? Well, metrics are hard. Like I said, the number of first-time contributors to GitHub repositories continues to grow. But is this actually measuring health, or are more of the same kind of people joining? Demographic data is not easy to come by or to interpret. If all you have is data from GitHub, this is not representative of diversity in your community. When we look at the Linux Foundation survey, 82% of survey respondents feel welcome in open source. But when you look at demographic segmentations, you see varied sentiments. People who do not feel welcome in open source are disproportionately from underrepresented groups. So we need to be very careful about metrics. Belonging, inclusion, and barriers can be subjective and contextual. We only measure what is easy to measure. As a teacher, I came to understand that exams and tests don't really assess knowledge or ability to solve problems. They assess what is easy to grade. These metrics are similar. We're only looking for the key that we lost where the lamp is. We must be transparent about what we're not measuring. So maybe we need to invest in exit surveys or follow-up individual interviews. In any case, we need better infrastructure to have better metrics. Now, a few more things that we can consider. First, we need to make sure that we are transparent. We need to admit that we have a problem. Hiding things or throwing them under the rug is not going to solve the problem. We want to be inclusive. This means listening and working with the people that are historically marginalized and not imagining what the ideal solution would be. We need to be active in supporting and recognizing the work of others. There is this concept of sponsorship, which is extremely powerful when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We want to make sure that people from underrepresented groups feel supported and feel recognized in the work that they do. We want to create safe environments, so code of conduct enforcement and having a plan in advance for when something happens is extremely important. Problems will happen. That's life. We need to be able to have a plan for when something happens, we know what to do. Now, we also need to admit our vulnerability. We are not perfect, and we need to be open to criticism and feedback. This is the only way we can actually learn something is by listening to others and understanding that when we make mistakes, we apologize and we move on by accepting criticism and by doing things better next time. This is the only way we can improve as a community. And finally, we need to be brave and have courage. As groups grow, they need to deal and learn from conflict. This is a known factor in large groups. The only groups where you will see zero conflict are the ones made up of people very similar to each other. And that's exactly what we don't want. Okay, so these are the soft skills. This is so hard. There's so many things to think about. Now, let's remember, we're all beginners. Be curious and educate yourself. You can read, listen, watch, do your research. There's an incredible amount of content out there. And it doesn't even have to be about DEI. Talk and listen to people who are different from you, who come from a different background, who speak a different language, or who live in a different country. Understanding other people's experiences and learning from them is what the internet is for. We have this opportunity, and it is extremely important that we remember this. Finally, remember, behind the screen, there are people. People have different motivations for contributing, and they are all valid. They don't have to be the same as yours. We can absolutely create human connection over open source projects, and this is good. This is not just about software. Software does not exist on a void. It is very much about people and the richness of human experience. Finally, remember to be compassionate. Recognize our shared humanity. Genuine curiosity about other people's experiences can go a long way towards creating a healthy environment in your open source project. This is what I had to say, and I am again extremely thankful to be here. I'll take any questions that you have, and I would be extremely happy to follow up here or later on social media, over email, and I would be extremely happy to hear what you think can be done for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Melissa, for joining us from Brazil. I'm Alex, I'm your session chair. You probably saw the live stream. So I'm going to read the audience questions from Slido to you. And the most popular question is, I'm just going to read them. This is very nice, but in reality, 90% of the open source project contributors come from professional teams and companies. How do you ensure diversity then?
Well, I think there are several things to unpack there. One is obviously there is a big problem with hiring and recruiting and outreach and creating a safe environment in companies for people to contribute. We also know that even in the companies that have people working professionally with open source, this is usually a small amount of time or something that they're expected to do in addition to their let's say, official work. And so it ends up being, again, some sort of privilege to be able to work on open source. So I do think that companies have, as I've said in the talk, companies have to be active about enabling this and making sure people have access and can actually participate and contribute. And I do believe that this is something that we need to ask for and advocate for in the companies. And I know it's not easy. I know that big companies, and this is a huge problem for open source projects in general, which is that the larger companies that actually benefit from the development of open source don't really contribute that much. And so this is something that we actually have to advocate for, is more support, more time, more options for people to contribute to open source. And then inside the companies, there's also a culture change that needs to happen for this to improve.
Thank you. The next question, we've got a few, but it's all right. We have 10 minutes, 12 minutes left, and there's a break, so no need to rush. Next question, imposter syndrome tends to be more common among minorities. Do you have any recommendations on how to deal with it when starting to contribute to open source?
That's a tough question because I'm actually feeling a lot of imposter syndrome right now talking to you. And so I do think that this is something that's very common. And I would say the best strategy that I found for myself in my experience is to get together with other people who are just getting started, creating networks of newcomers or creating networks of people who are contributing at the same experience level as you. And those connections and being able to help each other and talk to each other and share your experiences tends to help a lot. And so that's the number one recommendation that I would make. Of course, I also think that having mentors and having the feeling safe enough to ask questions also helps because you feel like people are actually listening to you and they value your experience, whatever it is. And then there's something else that I think leadership can do to improve the situation for people who are feeling imposter syndrome, which is putting yourself forward and asking the questions that you think the newcomers have. If you ask those questions, they will feel, well, it's not just me that has this question, you know, and other people feel it too. I'm not alone. And so this is there's a lot of things that leadership can do to improve the situation. And one of them is put yourself forward, ask the questions, be able to, create a safe environment for questions and for people who are just joining.
Thank you. The next question, in your experience, how would open source project benefit from more diversity?
Well, I think there's several. I think, first of all, I do believe that open source is meant to be benefiting everyone. And if you are looking to benefit everyone, everyone needs to be involved. How can you create a solution that is supposed to be universal if the people who are developing it are coming from a small group of people? And so I do think that having diversity in your teams improve the quality of the project. But in a larger sense, I just think it's the right thing to do, making sure that people have access, that they can actually, like, if they want to come to your project, that they feel safe enough to do so. I think that's just basic understanding of how people work. We should be welcoming, we should be providing this to people. If they cannot join because of barriers that we can actually remove, it would be wrong not to remove them. And so I think it's just, of course, there's the question of quality, which I deeply believe in. I think diverse teams do better projects, but I also think it's just the right thing to do from an ethical point of view, is allowing people to be able to access, to be able to participate, to feel safe enough so that they can give their own inputs to the project.
Thank you. The next question, should this talk not stop with a question how to attract more contributors? Why mixing the whole topic with diversity and racism?
Okay, so I think the question of bringing more people is, who are we bringing? Like I said in the beginning, there is no shortage of new contributors. They are joining the project. The question is where they're coming from, what is their experience, and what do they bring to the project? And so we want to have everyone. We want to be able to bring people from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of geographical locations, all sorts of national origins. And so if we are consistently bringing 90% of people from the global north, something is weird there. And so we need to put more effort where we have more trouble, let's say, where we have more difficulty bringing people in. So I do believe that this is important, that we need to question ourselves about why this is happening, and that we need to put in effort to understand why this happens. So this is fact that people are coming more from global north, and the people are coming more from the United States and Europe. And so I do believe that we need to open doors and invite everyone in.
Right, thank you. The next question, I'm just going to read this one. Okay, please stop voting because it's I have to keep track. This one, after a NumPy paper with an exclusively male author list was released, a student tweeted, "The P in NumPy stands for patriarchy." What's your take on that?
Thank you for the question. So I think this is I can say this is a very stressful moment for all of us. I was working in the project for about, I don't know, maybe 8 months. And it was really interesting to see how social media took a completely different take on whatever happened. And so, yes, there was, how can I say, legitimate and fair criticism that the paper had an all-male author list. However, we did go through, like me and other women who were working in the project, for example, we had a lot of abuse, and people online sending direct messages and threatening us and kind of doing a bunch of things that we did not want to happen, obviously. And I do think that we need to be careful about the social media and how we deal with those things and how these pile-ons happen. And so I believe that in the end result was positive. We ended up, this ended up sparking a whole conversation inside the project and inside other projects as well about how we can improve this for the future, how we don't want this to happen again. And so the net result is positive, which I think is great. And so that's what I'm trying to focus on, is how can we move forward? Like I said in the talk, we need to listen to criticism. We need to accept this and be humble about understanding what we're doing wrong and improving for the future. And this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to address this problem, and we're trying to do the best that we can so that this doesn't happen again. Lessons learned.
Thank you. How do you deal with a mix of pro and actual volunteers? How do you make decisions when some are working and others are volunteering?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question, and something that we try to do with NumPy and SciPy is having a strong governance model that includes people both from professional and volunteer points of view, and that we enable everyone to have a voice. And so my own particular understanding is that people who are professionally working in open source should make work easier for the volunteers. And so that's the basics that we stand on, which is doing the heavy lifting, doing the boring work, CI, taking care of things that volunteers don't usually pick up. And so that's how we started working on the documentation and creating the documentation team. Because a lot of people, they want to do new features, they want to work on code, and they want to start contributing to get their names as contributors to NumPy, and usually they don't want to do the heavy lifting of reorganizing documentation and things like that. And so if you do have the ability to have professionals working on your open source project, and you can have money for that, and you can have people who are paid to do that, pick up the things that are not usually done by volunteers. That's where you should be spending your money on, so that you can have a well-rounded project supported by all sides. That's what I believe in. I do think it's a delicate problem, and that we need to put that explicit in governance, which is not to let companies take over the project or decide everything for the project. If you want to have volunteer contributions, you need to include them in decision-making as well.
Yeah, thank you. We have 3 more questions. How can we encourage women and mothers especially to contribute more?
This is an interesting question for me. I'm a mom as well. I do think that this is hard, but we need to make sure that we have the support that people need. And this is not only for mothers. There are people who take care of their relatives. They have elderly people that they need to take care of. And there's all sorts of situations that could be looked at kind of the same way. I think that giving people setting expectations so that they know how they can contribute, how much time they'll spend in each task, how much time are they expected to spend every week, so that they can plan ahead. If you're doing events, if you're doing in-person meetups, that you have a space for children, or that you have a way for people to care for children, or I don't know, that you have childcare. A lot of meetups and groups are already doing that. I think it's super important. But more than that, I think it's enabling people to do work on their own rhythm. And so not expecting that they'll answer right away, or enabling them to do smaller tasks at a time so that they can pick up these projects and plan ahead with the time that they have. At least that's what I see from my experience. My biggest difficulty being a mother is finding the free time. Usually when you have any free time, you're spending with your family. And so being able to pick up 1 hour here, 1 hour there is just amazing. And that's when you can do actual work. If you have to spend 5 hours reading the manual to be able to start, then that's harder. And so having these smaller tasks and enabling people to have different entry points into the project might help.
Thank you. For maintainers, managing the project is a huge task. How can they focus on diversity alongside without burning out?
Yeah, so I do think that this is something that asks a lot of the maintainers, and which is why it usually we have maintainers doing everything in a project. It's very hard to have specialization. So the same people who are reviewing code, they're writing documentation and organizing community, are doing all of this kind of work together. One possibility is to have people who are focused exclusively on community and improving diversity or contributor experience, and doing that, focusing on that so they don't have to split themselves between several tasks. And I know this is not easy for smaller projects. So what I would say is do what you can. You don't have to do everything at once, because I do understand that this is a big ask, and I do understand that this is hard on especially volunteer maintainers, especially if you have an open source project that is not professionally maintained. And so do what you can, start small, start with what you can do. But yeah, consider separating these tasks, or at least writing them up. For one example is that we don't usually put community tasks as issues, but maybe you could be very explicit about what you want to achieve in terms of community, and other people can come and help you with that. It doesn't have to be one person doing everything. But for that, you need to be able to delegate. You need to be able to organize these tasks and what you see for the vision for your project. So that's what I would recommend for smaller projects. And I would love to hear from you as well. If you have suggestions, if you have ideas, if you have experience with that, I would love to hear.
Thank you. Last question. What do conferences add to the open source ecosystem? Where are conferences good? What could conference organizers do better in the future?
Well, one thing that I noted, and that I also know it's a big ask, I know it's hard, and you folks must be experiencing this right now, but enabling a remote participation model, I think, is really important, and does allow a lot more people to participate. We saw this in Brazil. We have our local PyCon, we call it Python Brazil. And the last 2 years where we were remote, we were 100% remote. There was just so many people joining, and we can feel how many people would never be able to join if it was in person, because they would have to travel. Brazil is a huge country. And so wherever you choose to do your conference, people will not be able to go. We have had also great experience in Brazil with having crowdfunding for PyLadies so that they could go to the conference. And we've seen a huge improvement in attendance just by having that working. Another thing, like I said before, childcare options, those are usually super important for people who have children who need to take them with them, who will be attending, need a room for breastfeeding, need a room for naps, and all of that infrastructure necessary for a child. But again, I know that it can be complicated and that it can be hard and costly. It costs money. So I guess it depends on the possibilities that you have for your conference. Another thing, which is something that I'm not the first person to say, but I will say it anyway, is to be active when you're searching for speakers, when you're looking for your keynotes, when you're looking for people who are going to present at the conference. Be active about not just looking in one place for your speakers. search widely, go look at other places, go ask people about different topics, different people from different countries, people from different origins that can come and speak at your conference. That's the moment where you can actually connect and talk to people who have different experiences from you. So that's when you can take advantage of that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think if you were here, I think we could continue for 1, 2, 3 more hours. Unfortunately, we have a schedule. I will thank you very much for joining us from Brazil. We all hope to meet you in person somewhere around the world soon. Thank you very much, Melissa, for joining us.